the person who brought down the
species barrier, or broke the species barrier. So you've heard of people, of the pilot that is the first to have broken the sound barrier, to have flown faster than the speed of sound. And do you remember that gentleman's name?
Chuck Yeager.
Okay, so that was Chuck Yeager. In sort of an intellectual way, Darwin was the Chuck Yeager of biology. He brought down the species barrier. What was that? That was everything that had gone before him, and it was the idea of the species in the biosphere are fixed. So if we look at Plato and the Greeks, in Plato's view, physical objects were simply manifestations of the forms of these metaphysical essences, divine essences that were out there in the universe. And forms are stable objects of knowledge. Material things are reflections of these ideals, these perfect forms. And material particulars strive after these forms. Let me bring that into biology. If you study a biological entity, let's say a fossil, and you have some new collections and you think it's a certain species, you could go to the museum that houses the specimen that was used to name that species. That's the type specimen. That is the name bearer. That is like the ideal. And then you compare it to that. So in Plato's view, species were perfect. There's a lot of variety in this classroom and among humans on campus. That's just confusion, that's just chatter, that's noise that obscures this quintessential essence of what a human is. Okay? In Genesis it says, in the beginning God created all these species, things that creep on the earth and swim in the oceans and fly in the air. William Whewell, who is a mineralogist, who is the one who's responsible for actually coining the term scientist in science, was one of Darwin's Cambridge professors, and he said species have a real existence in nature, and a transition from one to the other does not exist. So that was the intellectual, sort of spiritual environment into which Darwin came. And he accepted this initially, like basically everybody else did. Three great authorities: the ancient Greeks, the Bible, so Jerusalem, Athens, and also modern thinkers, scientists. So in a nutshell, this is why, again, Darwin's remembered, because he brought biological science, or he brought biology out of supernatural wondering into science, experimental science, and it's been there ever since. So here's a quote from an evolutionary biologist. And a couple things here. Darwin brought biology out of the Middle Ages. For divine design and unknowable supernatural forces, he substituted natural material causes. Isn't that what Hutton did? Just said we can explain the earth around us by an appeal to natural causes, natural processes, if we have enough time over which they can operate. Darwin did the same thing for biology. He replaced a young static world by one in which there had been constant change for countless eons. Here's really the linchpin. He established that life had a history, and in this proved the essential view that differentiated evolutionary thought from all that had gone before. He said, all life is a function of descent with modification, and it's all related back to some ancestral form, and humans are part of that chain of ancestry. So let's get to this stuff. So let's do this. Let's take the first paragraph of The Origin of Species, not his first book or his last, but perhaps his most famous. And he starts out this way: went on board the HMS Beagle as naturalist. So let's start there. Why in the heck did Charles Darwin end up on a voyage around the world as a naturalist on the Beagle? One of the reasons he's saying this in the first paragraph of The Origin of Species is it's been 25 years since he's really been in the public limelight after he'd published what's now called The Voyage of the Beagle. It was a runaway bestseller. And he was that famous person who had traveled around the world and shared his adventures and discoveries with the world. He's now coming back 25 years later and saying, hey, do you remember that famous person? That's me. Okay? And anyway, he wanted to establish some credibility before he downloaded what ended up being a controversial. So let's delve into that just a little bit, and went on board the Beagle and why. So he's in the right family, right place, right time. Here is Charles Robert Darwin's father, Robert Waring Darwin. He was a medical doctor in the town of Shrewsbury, where we'll spend a little bit of time. He was the son of Erasmus Darwin. And Erasmus Darwin from Lichfield had a medical practice in Lichfield. He had gone to Edinburgh Medical School, gotten his training there, and become a doctor. He was also a thinker, and he spent time in Birmingham with a group of gentlemen known as the Lunatic Society, or Lunar Society, and they would meet on nights of the full moon in Birmingham, one of the centers of the Industrial Revolution, and think about how science and human intellect could advance the human cause. Joseph Priestley, the discoverer of oxygen, was there. The founder of the cotton gin steam engine were there. And so this was a rather august group. Also, he had written a book, big thick book named Zoonomia, wherein he speculated about transmutation. And so Charles's paternal grandfather already had those thoughts. Young Charles never met his grandfather. On the other side, his mom's dad was named Josiah Wedgwood, who was the owner of the Wedgwood Potteries in Staffordshire, and so a very, very wealthy family. Money here, he was a clever investor in the railroads at the time. He also had a very lucrative practice, and so the Darwin Wedgwood family was pretty well off. The Wedgwoods and the Darwins hated slavery. So at the pottery, Grandpa Wedgwood made this medallion that was available. It says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And here's the potteries at Staffordshire. We won't have time to visit there, though. So here's some of the Darwin sites. Shrewsbury, where he was born in the Welsh borders. Edinburgh, that we'll talk about. Cambridge, Malvern, where he went to get the water cures. London, where he gave papers and things. Down where he and his family, wife Emma, and kids lived most of their life. So he was born in the medieval town of Shrewsbury on the Severn River. Beautiful medieval town with churches and old part of town. There's the town of Shrewsbury, Severn River. And up to the right, out of the picture, is the family home. So wealthy Dr. Darwin built a not so modest home of red brick, and this was called the Mount. And in this room on February 12th, 1809, Susanna Wedgwood gave birth to her fifth of 6 children, 3 older girls, an older brother named Erasmus, and now young Charles. We'll be able to visit here. It should be open. We should be able to go in, walk up the stairs, and take a look around. So this is where the Darwin kids grew up. Unfortunately, so here's front door, walk in, here's the stairs up to that room that we just saw. It's now some sort of city building with computers and functionaries doing their thing. Susanna Wedgwood, when Charles was 8 years old, she died. So he was basically raised by his older 3 sisters. So when he was the appropriate age, he was baptized in St. Chad's Church, the Anglican church downtown. And it wasn't that the family were staunch members of the Anglican church. They were actually Unitarians, which is called a feather-bed catch-falling Christian, so it was a liberal sort of form of Christianity. But because the young doctor wanted to stay in the good graces of potential patients, and his patients he had his children baptized in the Anglican Church just for appearances. So we will walk through these doors and go into the main part of the chapel there, and right up towards the front by the podium is this beautiful baptismal font made out of polished Mississippian crinoidal limestone, and that's where Darwin was baptized.
That's where you went wrong, right there.
Yeah, right there.
Should have been granite.
Now, Dad, Mom went around. Dad wanted his boys to grow up as gentlemen. So at a young age, he was sent off to boarding school downtown, to Reverend Butler's school in Shrewsbury. Here's what it looked like in 1815. Here's what it looked like in, actually, 2013. Right by the front door is a statue of its most famous student, and that's a statue of Charles. Darwin hated this school because it was just rote memorization of the classics, so that when he was in high society, he'd be able to discuss and talk intelligently about the important things of the day. Where he was a kid, he was so curious and just always wanted to look at things and turn them around and think about them. So he didn't get along really well with Reverend Butler. Right off the picture is a dorm here, or a building, and the kids lived in the upper attic. And Darwin, to his dying day, remembered the stench of the urine-soaked beds and things in this sort of poorly circulated room. So he didn't have a great time there at Reverend Butler School. But here he is now sitting out in front of it. And it says, in the summer of 1818, I went to Dr. Butler's great school in Shrewsbury and remained there for 7 years till midsummer 1825 when I was 16. Nothing could have been worse for the development of my mind than Dr. Butler's schools. It was strictly classical, nothing else being taught except a little ancient geography and history. The school as a means of education was simply a blank. So he and his brother got into all sorts of trouble. They had a chemistry set. They were always blowing stuff up, using their dad's money, blowing up stuff in the garden. So very inquisitive. He collected stamps. He collected anything. When that statue went up, shortly after that statue went up, a couple blocks away at St. Mary's Church, lightning hit the tower and blew off the top of it. And so you can see the part that's been rebuilt out of a white sandstone instead of the red sandstone. And the clergyman at this church, said that God was punishing Shrewsbury for putting up a statue to someone as evil as Darwin. Seems pretty weird that he would punish the local, believers for the fact that, anyway, local lore. One of the things that Darwin saw downtown is a thing called the Bell Stone. We'll swing by here. And here's what he says about the Bell Stone. He says, yet I felt sure that I was prepared for a philosophical treatment of the subject, for an old Mr. Cotton in Shropshire, who knew a good deal about rocks, had pointed out to me 2 or 3 years previously a well-known large erratic boulder in the town of Shrewsbury called the Bell Stone. He told me that there was no rock of the same kind nearer than Cumberland or Scotland, and he solemnly assured me that the world would come to an end before anyone would be able to explain how this stone came where it now lay. This produced a deep impression on me, and I meditated over this wonderful stone, so that I felt the keenest delight when I first read of the action of icebergs in transporting boulders, and I gloried in the progress of geology. So here's a glacial erratic that prior to the theory of ice ages, it was a real puzzle as to how this thing got where it did. This is where the Wedgwood family lived in Staffordshire at Mare Hall, so maybe even a little more regal than the Mount. And so this is where the Wedgwood family and cousins and Charles's future wife grew up. Now, because Reverend Butler School was not a great success, Charles was sent off to Edinburgh to medical school. So let me give a little bit of context here. This is Old College. This part of the University of Edinburgh was built between 1790 and 1824. Darwin was there 1825 to early 1827. The tower on here, or the dome, was put on about 50 years later. So when Darwin went to classes here, the buildings look like this, brand new, no dome up on the top. So his big brother Erasmus had gone to Christ College and had been studying medicine. He then needed to do his practicums at Edinburgh Medical School, which was the elite medical school of the 1800s. In Leiden in Belgium had been, but now it had been eclipsed by Edinburgh. So Erasmus Darwin went to Edinburgh, got his medical training. Robert Waring Darwin, Charles's and Erasmus's dad, went to medical school, guess where? Edinburgh. Robert Darwin, the father, actually followed a few years later in the footsteps of his big brother, Charles Darwin. And Charles was a very promising medical student. A child had died of a disease. Charles had been given the cadaver to do some dissections on. This child had encephalitis. The young Charles Darwin nicked his finger with the knife that he had been carving the body on, and he came down with the same disease and died a few days later. So his little brother Robert finishes his medical school. Instead of going to Lichfield and starting practice with his father Erasmus, he went to the town of Shrewsbury, found out they needed some medical help there. And so he went and started his practice there. So here's Erasmus and here's young Charles, the Charles of our story. What do you think Dad expected them to do? Go to medical school, right? Now, because Reverend Butler's school was not the best environment for young Charles, when Erasmus went to Edinburgh in 1825, Charles was sent with him. He was 16 years old and was off to medical school. Now, Edinburgh was referred to as the Athens of the North. It was a riotous place. It was the seat of the Enlightenment that had happened a generation before. That's where Hutton and Adam Smith and other people of the Enlightenment were. So it was a very, very liberal city with beliefs there or disputations about religion that young Charles wouldn't have been exposed to back in Cambridge or back in Shrewsbury. So off he went to school. Here's a map of Edinburgh. The castle is here. Holyrood Palace is here, so the Royal Mile is down there. So just to the south and a little bit east is where the university was. And over here, this is called the Westport part of town, and remember that, we'll come back. So just below to the south of the castle, we'll talk about that a little bit later. So Darwin, the Darwins, Charles and his brother Erasmus, move into student housing, and Mrs. McKay was the manager of these dorms. The dorms are long gone. This building has been built in its place, but sitting over the top of the door is this plaque that says, "On this site, Charles Darwin, author of The Origin of Species, lodged at 11 Lothian Street while studying medicine at the University of Edinburgh, 1825 to 1827. So he was there from October 1825 through April 1827, so he was there for about 18 months. His brother was there the first year with him, and here's a sketch of Erasmus, older at this point. He would have been 20-ish, a few years older than the 16-year-old Charles, but this is even older still. So he was only there for the first part of the year, or for the first year. Then he decided he didn't like medicine, moved to London, and basically didn't do anything, just hobnobbed in society, never really pursued a lot after that. So when they got there, because they were from a fairly wealthy family, they were supposed to go, they had all these papers of introduction, supposed to go meet all these famous people and well-heeled people and connected people, and they did that for a little bit and then think, this ain't gonna happen, so they stopped doing it. They went to their classes, didn't socialize a whole lot, but there are records that still exist of all the books that they checked out, and they were very voracious readers. Of course, imagine October through February in Edinburgh. What do you think the weather was like? Yeah, so it'd be good, sit in, snuggle down with a good book and do a lot of reading. But, so Darwin didn't like the classes all that much. One of the classes that he chose was chemistry, and the lecturer there was Thomas Charles Hope. He was the discoverer of strontium. I remember Erasmus and young Charles would blow stuff up back at home, mix chemicals and light stuff. So he really, really enjoyed this chemistry course. Said that was one of the best courses that he had taken there. One thing you should know. The professors at University of Edinburgh did not get a full salary. The way they made their money was by attracting large numbers of students to their sections of courses. So if you were a really boring lecturer, then you may not have as many. There was no real prescribed course of study like you have to take freshman, junior, sophomore, junior, and so on. You'd sort of take classes as you wanted to, and there were certain core classes you had to take, but otherwise it was sort of electives. So we really enjoyed the chemistry. He took a geology course from the naturalist Robert E. Jameson. And here is the book that Jameson wrote, Manual of Mineralogy, containing an account of simple minerals and also a description arrangement of mountain rocks. Published in Edinburgh, 1821. So here's this 4-year-old textbook that he had, hot off the press. The sole effect they produced on me, his lectures, was the determination never as long as I lived to read a book on geology or in any way study the science. So Jameson's lectures were maybe not as interesting as they could have been. Here's the book, the manual, Jameson Mineralogy, stratified structure, seamed structure, structure of veins, stratified, so on. Here's a couple pages. Now, I don't understand why this would not just be compelling reading. Fossil salts. Crystals are small and very small and adhere or intersect one another. Lateral planes of the crystals usually smooth. Externally shining, internally splendent or shining and luster vitreous. Man, imagine just reading how exciting that is, right? To hear somebody just recite that. Anyway. Shoot. Oh, there we go. One of the professors that had an influence on Darwin was not from University of Edinburgh. So let me finish my thought here that I started. So you took elective classes, you paid the professor to sit in on their course. So there were people who were experts in the field that weren't affiliated with the university that would set up their own courses and would attract people to them. So there was this competition between the university people and these intellectuals that were sort of freelancing, doing their own thing. One of them at Barclays was this gentleman. Here he is, much older when he was the biologist at University of London. But when he was a young man, he was taught biology, and young Charles joined a society called the Plinian Society. He was invited to do that. It was around for about 20 years, but it was an intellectual club. They would meet one night a week, and people who would be doing research on biology or chemistry or geology would report, sort of like the Student Research Conference. And they could report on what they'd been finding and then have discussions, and professors would come interact with them and so on. So this gentleman's important for two reasons. Even though Darwin, in his autobiography, doesn't have a lot of respect for him, and we'll see why that is. But Grant, he would take young Charles and they would go for walks out in nature down by the Firth of Forth, that coastline north of Edinburgh, and they would look at the invertebrates there, and they would collect them and they would do research on them. And then they would, as they were walking along one day, according to Darwin's biography, Grant opened up to him and he said, "I am a great admirer of Lamarck." Lamarck was the French biologist, vertebrate specialist, who believed in transmutation. So you may have heard of Lamarckian evolution. It wasn't really, if you were at Cambridge, you wouldn't be able to confess that. Jameson was also a Neptunist and also a devotee of Lamarck. So as they were walking, I basically confessed to Darwin, I believe in evolution. And your grandfather's book, Zoonomia, has been a great inspiration to me. So he was basically trying to schmooze young Darwin. Here's the grandson of this, my intellectual hero. So he took him under his wing. They did experiments together on sea mats, on Flustra, which is a bryozoan. And Darwin did some original research, and Grant took credit for it. And when he published 2 or 3 of these findings that Darwin had made, he didn't give Darwin credit for any of it. So that really soured Charles on Grant as a mentor. Now it's too bad Randy's not here, because he said that you always have to be holding a cephalopod, right? So here Grant's holding a rock. This is Flustra. This is a lacy bryozoan. And what young Charles did was looked at the polyps and looked at the zooids and worked out the reproductive strategy and determined that this, in fact, was actually a living animal and a bryozoan. And they did some other similar things. While at Edinburgh, Charles also took advantage of his contact and relationship with a remarkable freed slave by the name of John Edmonston. And John Edmonston was a world-class taxidermist. So Charles sat at his feet and worked with him for many an hour and learned how to preserve and stuff animals. I think that helped him when he was on the Beagle voyage and had specimens to get sent back home. Absolutely. So Darwin writes very, very fondly of John Edmonston. Okay, I thought he was supposed to be in medical school. So far we've seen geology and a little bit of biology and so on. But what about biology, or what about medical school? The head anatomist at the university was Alexander Monroe Tertius. What that means basically is the third. For 124 years, from the time his grandfather Alexander I started teaching anatomy, then his son took over and taught anatomy, then he took over and taught anatomy through his career. For 124 years, anatomy was taught by the Alexander Monroes. And Darwin hated his lectures. He thought they were one of the most, again, sort of like the geology, just boring, boring, boring. One of the things, though, that he wishes he would have paid more attention and finished with was dissections. So at this time, anatomy was a huge thing, and it was a very liberal anatomy. People were saying that the body is a machine, it's not something necessarily of divine origin, and that, so that didn't set well with the religious groups. But they were really trying to apply medical science and understand just the physics, biophysics behind anatomy. So he taught anatomy. One of the things that you would need, of course, if you're going to do dissection is what? The body. Before 1832, when an act was passed by the Scottish government, it was illegal to desecrate the body of someone who had died that was not an orphan, had not committed suicide, or was not an executed prisoner. After 1832, it was legal for you to consign your body to medical science or for your loved ones to sell your body for medical science. So if your family was destitute and you died, they could sell your body for either 7 or 10 pounds to these anatomists, which would be, a couple $1,000s, right? So here's Dr. Alexander Monro III. Here's the Royal Infirmary. So Darwin would have gone to the university bookstore, and instead of getting a rock hammer and a hand lens, he would have bought a kit that looks like that in the upper right. So he's going into carpentry, I guess, right? Got that nice saw. What do you think that saw's for? Bones. It's a bone saw. Here is one of the medical theaters. So you can picture, let's put young Charles in that seat right there. Let's put the operating table down in the middle, and the TA would have come in and lined the edges of the table with buckets of sawdust. What would that be for? Catch all the gore, right? So Darwin was subject to 2 of these. The second one that ended his medical career was a young child who needed to have an arm amputated. So they brought the child in, held him down on the table. Now, what kind of anesthesia was there at the time? None. So this was the time of heroic medicine. The best doctors were the ones that could cut fastest. So Darwin was sitting right about here watching this young child writhe in pain as the doctor was sawing off his arm. And Darwin decided that, it ain't for me. So he headed back home as a failure. He was supposed to live up to his namesake, his Uncle Charles, and follow in his father's footsteps. Erasmus had already washed out as a doctor. So it was not a real welcoming atmosphere when he got back to Shrewsbury. Shortly thereafter, and this kind of give you an idea of part of why, one of the things Darwin felt repulsed by. So Dr. Monro, he put together the Museum of Anatomy. And this is still a thing at the university there in Edinburgh. And we could go visit if we have time. I think it is free. But this is it in the 1800s. Bones of every size, shape, configuration, organism, and all sorts of other things that you could think of. So that's pretty cool museum. One of the other doctors doing anatomy at the time, very popular lecturer at Barclay, so in direct competition with Monro for students and for cadavers, was Dr. Robert Knox. Now there was, in Edinburgh at the time, 2 Irishmen by the name of Robert Burke and Robert Hare. And this is Robert Burke's death mask. He's the one on the far side there. The one on the far side, Robert Burke, married young in Ireland, had a falling out with his father-in-law, so left his wife and 2 children and moved to Edinburgh. And he was a navvy on the Union Canal. And there's another gentleman that came from, or maybe not a gentleman, another guy that came from Armagh in Ireland. And he and his wife moved to Scotland. He was looking for work too, and during a summer of doing harvesting, they met each other and became fast friends. The Hares, husband and wife, had a boarding house of sorts on Tanner's Close. So on their main streets in Edinburgh, and then there are these little narrow sidewalks between them that are called closes. And on Tanner Close, they had this boarding house, and that's where the four of them lived. Now, at one point, well, let me do this first. In the graveyard at Edinburgh, we'll see things that look like this. Once there was a market for dead bodies, and hanged criminals, dead orphans, or suicides, there were not enough of those to provide cadavers for the medical researchers. So people started to take bodies from graves. They were called resurrection men, or bag men, sack men. So they go watch a funeral, then that night they go dig up the fresh body and go get money for it. Okay? So people started to put these metal guards over top of it, at least long enough for the body to rot so it wouldn't be of value to people digging it up. Here's a picture of Burke and Hare. At the boarding house was a fellow named Old Donald, and he died of whatever disease it was, and he still owed the Hares £4 for his lodgings. So the undertaker made a casket, there was a sermon of sorts, and then Burke and Hare took Old Donald out of his grave, filled it with other stuff, and that went and got buried, and they took the body up to the university. And we're saying, where can we find someone who would buy a body to dissect? They were looking for Monroe. And a student said, take it to Robert Knox. He's looking for bodies. So they took Old Donald, they got £7 and 14 shillings, so they paid off the debt, plus had some money to go drinking and carousing. They thought, this is pretty good money. So then there was another person who was ill in the apartment buildings, but wasn't dying very fast, so they decided to what's now called Burke him, or Burking. So Hare would lay across the body to hold him down, and Burke would hold their jaw shut, pinch their nose shut, and suffocate them. So that came to be known as Burking. And over the next several months, in 1828, they killed 18 people. So prostitutes or someone staying at the boarding house. The last victim was an elderly woman from Ireland, and they said, oh, we have those same named people in our family. Why don't you come stay with us? And then they burked her. Two of the people they killed were very well known. One of them was called Daft Jamie. He was sort of intellectually stunted, and he had a club foot, and he would sing and dance and tell jokes. So he was pretty well known around town. So one day, Daft Jamie shows up on the dissecting table, and the students go, Dr. Knox, that's Daft Jamie. And he goes, no, it's not. He cut off the head and foot before anybody could then come back and identify him. There was a certain prostitute named Mrs. Patterson, and I don't know how, but the students said, hey, we know her. And he said, no, you don't. So finally, there was this elderly woman that they got her drunk, and then they suffocated her. And there was a couple that knew her, and they came looking for her, and they found her body stuffed under the bed. Then they found belongings to some of these other people. So the police came and arrested all the Burke Hare and their wives who were complicit. But they didn't have enough evidence, since they didn't have the bodies at this point. They'd been dissected. So they went to Hare and said, if you'll turn state's evidence, we'll exonerate you. So he confessed, turned in Burke. Burke was hanged. And then, as part of his punishment, he was sent to Dr. Monroe, who did a dissection. And his skeleton was rendered, and the skeleton is in the Museum of Anatomy to this day. And here it is. Irish male. Skeleton of William Burke, the notorious murderer, hanged at Edinburgh, 28 January 1829. And then when he was cutting open his head, Monroe took a pen and he wrote this note. This is written with the blood of William Burke, who was hanged in Edinburgh, on and on and on. Take blood taken from his head. So Edinburgh is a very, very interesting place. And that, you know, we could probably spend a whole week there going to museums and, you know, just the history of it. But okay, so this was just a year, so this is a year after Darwin got out of there, but still the body trade, he knew, you know, it was just, he knew bad things were happening and he just didn't want anything to do with that kind of medical stuff. So he gets home, goes hunting for a while, and then Dad sends him off, or they mutually decide that he'll go to Cambridge. So we'll run into Darwin again at Cambridge. And he went to Christ College where his brother went, but instead of medical school, he learned the 39 Articles of the Anglican faith and was going to become a country parson. So he could tend to his flock, but have plenty of time to go hunting and collecting and do the gentlemanly things that he wanted to. There again, he ran into a mentor, a great scientist. But this one, to be a professor at Cambridge, you also had to take the 39 or take the holy orders. So for a while, I was a bishop at BYU on weekends and an evening or whenever I'd get called. Plus, I was also teaching courses, so it was a similar thing. They had religious responsibilities as well as academic responsibilities. Again, Darwin was sitting at the feet of someone who wrote the book on botany. So here's Henslow's book. They went out beetling, and Darwin was one of the best at it. They conspired to go on a trip to the tropics to collect bugs and plants. Henslow gave him a copy of a book from a German world traveler whose name's escaping me right now, and that book was very popular, and he just exalted in the diversity of the tropics. So Darwin just really wanted to go, and they were conspiring to go to the tropics in the Atlantic Ocean, equatorial Atlantic, and all that fell through. Darwin would love to go to Evensong at King's College in Cambridge, and we'll have a chance to visit this. Here's what Christ College looked like then and now. And for those of you who are Harry Potter fans, Cambridge is very much like that. There are these different colleges that each have their own insignias and colors and banners and all that stuff, like Gryffindor. Did I get that right? And he would also live right in the college. So you go through those doors, and then there are dorms there as well as classrooms. These are the rooms that young Charles occupied. The thing that's interesting, a generation before, these same rooms were occupied by William Paley, who wrote the book Natural Theology, which was very influential. Darwin said that's the only book he really read there that left a real indelible impression, although later Darwin would find some things that overturned that. He also, at Christ College, ran into Adam Sedgwick, who was the father of the Cambrian system, and we will have an opportunity to go to the Sedgwick Museum that was established by Sedgwick and has some just amazing fossils in it. This is the street that Darwin lived on when he was a student there at Cambridge. So from 36 to 37 lived on that street. After he graduated, he headed back to Shrewsbury. 2 weeks later, Adam Sedgwick showed up. And they had planned to do a trip from the Welsh border, so Shrewsbury would be here. And for a period of 2 weeks, they traveled together following this route along the Old Red Sandstone up to Colwyn and Great Orm's Head, and then they separated, and Darwin did some research on his way back home, and those notes are still extant. So he was helping Adam Sedgwick on his seminal work on the Cambrian system in Wales. And he was learning how to become a keen geological observer, being trained by one of the best geologists in the world. Geologist at Cambridge, Adam Sedgwick. Well, when Darwin got home, I think I'll have to end on this. When Darwin got home from his 2-week journey, there were 2 letters waiting for him. One was from the Admiralty, the other was from the captain of the Beagle, and they were inviting him to go on a 2 to 5 year journey around the world. as naturalist on HMS Beagle. His father had a knee-jerk negative reaction and wrote out a long list of his objections to it. He would view it as him changing majors again. You were a doctor, now you're a clergyman, this is going to be bad for your reputation. You'll have a wanderlust, you'll never settle down. This will be bad for your reputation. Somebody else must have turned it down. Why would they go to you first? And if since somebody obviously turned it down, there must be something wrong with it. But if you can find a sane person to argue your case, I'll acquiesce and I'll help pay for it. So Charles went up to Mayor Hall, Staffordshire, got with one of his well-known Wedgwood cousins. He came down and talked some sense into his dad. And the rest, as they say, is history. So we're out of time today, but next time we'll talk a little about the Beagle Voyage, but more about what Darwin did, where he was in England after he got back.
So did other voyages also have naturalists? It was kind of a common, like the cook on the ship or the captain?
Normally, if you've watched Captain and Master and Commander, if you've watched that, that's accurate. Generally, the surgeon is the de facto naturalist. The fact that why am I blanking on his name? Help me out with it. Who's the captain of the Beagle? Shoot, I can picture his face. Anyway, he had been, so real quick to answer that question. The captain,
Robert Fitzroy.
yeah, thank you. Fitzroy was in South America on a different ship when the Beagle was on a previous voyage under the captaincy of Pringle Stoke. So here they are in the southern waters, the stormy, cold waters of southern South America. He's doing surveying. He had all these things he had to do for the Admiralty, and he was a man on a psychological, emotional island because he couldn't interact with the crew because he was this social stratum, they were a bunch of riffraff. Feeling the stress of the responsibility and just the separation from his family and all that, he put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. It took him 9 days to die from the infection. Fitzroy was charged with taking the Beagle back home, and he took 4 Fuegans with him, tried to civilize him, which is a different story, brought him back. So then he was assigned to come back and finish what Pringle Stoke had not done. And he at that point thought, I have an uncle who just killed himself. Melancholia runs in our family. I need to have a confidant. I need to have someone that I can let my hair down with, someone I can have dinner with and talk to. That's why Darwin was invited. And the ship's naturalist, or the doctor, surgeon, when they got to South America, said, Darwin's getting all the attention, I'm out of here. He left. Make a long story short, several years after they got back from the Beagle voyage, Fitzroy took a straight-edged razor and drew it across his neck. So his concern about having melancholy or depression was justified.
On that happy note?
Yeah, on that happy note, we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Scott.